So we know in the state of Utah, 1 in 3 women are going to be impacted by some form of rape and sexual assault. And then I think the statistic for men is 1 in 6 in the state of Utah.
And the reason it's mostly women coming out is because they're the majority of the victims. But that's why it's important for male victims and non-gender conforming victims or non-binary victims as well to speak up, to say this happens all the way around, you know.
I think when people make harmful comments, it's generally a place of ignorance. I think sometimes it's hard for people to look inward and realize that maybe they are the problem. I think that there are people who realize, I think when Me Too came out, there were people, men and women, who realized, like, oh no, I have done a behavior similar to the one described here.
It's hard to accept because we don't want to feel that pain, we don't want to deal with it. We don't want to know what's happening sometimes because then we have to listen and we have to change and we have to learn and we have to grow, and all of those things can be a little bit uncomfortable. But I think it's necessary because there have been certain behaviors that have been tolerated up until this point that don't need to be tolerated.
This female was assaulted or raped, but look what she was wearing. Oh, almost like she deserved it.
And as humans, we tend to, like, if we don't like something or we don't understand something, we kind of shut down, or it scares us so we don't talk about it, or it's uncomfortable to talk about so we don't talk about it. And I have noticed growing up, I'm thinking about where I am right now and what situation I was in. I was never taught what to do in that situation.
Victim blaming is when we look at the victim of sexual violence or interpersonal violence of any kind, and we say, what was that person doing to cause them to have this crime committed against them? So in the case of sexual violence, it's often, what were they wearing? Were they drinking? Were they using drugs? Were they out late with this person or that person? And we look for reasons to say, oh, that explains why this happened to them, because they were doing this.
There are always individuals who will question my story and say, well, but you shouldn't have been there in the first place, is what I hear a lot. And I'll say, that's not the point.
Shaming someone for something that they know nothing about is dangerous. The shaming, I think, is very destructive for anyone who has been assaulted or who has experienced any kind of situation where they were uncomfortable in, whether it was a rape, an assault, a harassment, whatever you want to call it, wherever they felt, they already feel ashamed. And shaming that and judging them is dangerous. And I think it changes how they're going to overcome this.
I think just society in general has so long just not trusted women, and that's generally who is being blamed as victims. And I think women haven't gotten their due in a lot of ways, and that's still the case. I mean, you look at the gender pay gap, and there's just a lot of things that are coming up that are now finally being talked about and addressed, and I think that's just how society is in general, unfortunately.
Because when I grew up, that's how I was taught in certain aspects. Religiously you learned these lessons, and this is how you had to behave morally. And the morality was there, but it was your responsibility to say no and to stop it because you were the girl.
Questions that make the victim feel ashamed of what has happened to them, or guilt, like it's their fault. Those are the questions that you stay away from generally. It doesn't matter what somebody was wearing when they were abused or raped or hurt. It doesn't matter if they were under the influence of something, and it doesn't matter if they were alone with somebody. It doesn't matter. It still happened, and there's no excuses for it.
We did workshops at Cypress High School, and so we decided to go ahead and go with random questions at the end where everyone would turn in a slip, even if it's just a random thought or whatever. And we had everything from I don't have a thought to I like A1 steak sauce. But we also had somebody submit a drawing of a penis. After we're talking about sexual violence and harassment, like, why would you do that? And so it's important that we call it out. We don't consider it normal. You can't be normal and a rapist. And we know that, but we play into it with what we do. At the same time, some of the questions we get, one of them was along the lines of, I was 6 years old, he threatened to murder my parents, and I was scared. And that's all it said. And this is a 10th grader writing this on a piece of paper to a stranger. So we need to face the fact that it's happening in our community and do something about it.
I had some friends who they were just really great, and they were so fun to be around, and they introduced me to some boys that they were hanging out with at the time. And this guy who assaulted me, I'd hung out with him maybe 2 or 3 times before that. He seemed normal, like no weird red flags and nothing that I thought was concerning at all. But on New Year's we were alone together, and it was terrifying. And he hurt me. He assaulted me, and I think for a week, probably a good week afterwards, I was in like it's just a state of shock. Like I didn't sleep, I didn't eat, I just woke up. If I slept, went to work, and I didn't talk to anybody. I just shut down almost completely. And all of a sudden I started to feel this like insane guilt, and I thought that I had done something wrong, like it was my fault, and that I let something go too far or farther than I wanted it to go, and it was my fault. And so these friends were so curious what had happened between me and this guy, and I told them, I was like, I don't want to talk about it. It was no big deal. I don't want to talk about it though. And I slowly came to realize that it would come back in flashes of things that would happen. I couldn't sleep at night, and I had these nightmares, like just recurring nightmares of what had happened. And I all of a sudden was like, I think I was assaulted. And how do you know for sure if you've never been in the situation? It's just it's such a weird limbo place to be. And I all of a sudden was like, I think I was hurt. I didn't want to do any of that. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know where to go. So I started telling people. And the first person I told, she looked at me and she said, "This isn't your fault, and I believe you."
Our ideals of consent start from when we're really young, right? And so we'll have a lot of kids saying, sometimes like my parents will say, give mommy a hug or else you don't love her, right? What is that messaging, about consent? Like, it starts from when we're really, really young. But when it comes to like a sexual relationship, we also like to teach consent in the context of boundaries, right? So having an awareness of your partner's boundaries, having an awareness of your boundaries, being able to respect your partner's boundaries, and also respect how you feel and when you feel uncomfortable to protect your boundaries. How do you communicate about that?
I think sometimes we need to think about the impact of our behavior regardless of the intent. And the more we can talk about things like, what is consent? That it's not like the movies. It's not like what we see in the media every day. it's okay to stand back and have a conversation about what kind of sexual contact you want to have with the person, and is that okay?
When we're talking about consent, what we're talking about is how to have those healthy boundaries, how to establish your values, how to think about those beforehand, and know what you're okay with and what you're not okay with.
We need to educate. We need to talk about this. This needs to be dinner conversation with our families. We need to know as mothers and fathers that we can talk about this and that it's important.
We do know what consent means, right? But when it comes to a relationship, or more specifically a sexual relationship, we're finding that consent is really tricky. So we actually like to talk about that. What's difficult about consent? One of the questions that I love to ask in any classroom space is, what's hard about saying no, right? Like, why is it hard to say no to your partner sometimes? And then also, what's hard about accepting no?
Trying to get people to understand that freely given doesn't mean just that you didn't physically force a person, but even coercion and trying to convince someone, those kind of things, that's not healthy behavior. We'll talk about consent not only in a sexual way. As a matter of fact, we'll focus more on consenting to someone holding your hand or giving you a hug or giving you a kiss on the cheek. Say if you consent to someone giving you a hug, are you always automatically comfortable with them kissing you on the cheek at the same time? So are you specific about what your consent is? Do you know what your boundaries are? I think those are healthy behaviors to have from a young age, knowing that you have some control over your body and what you do and your behaviors.
It was like the second or third week of school. My friends and I got invited to go to this party off campus, and we were drinking and doing whatever people in college do sometimes. And we went out to this party. I met this guy at the party, and he seemed like a nice enough guy. I didn't know him, but I guess I didn't get any bad vibe from him at all. So we hit it off. He asked me for my number, and he asked me if I wanted to hang out later that night. So I invited him over to my house to hang out with my roommates and I, because, this is easier, hang out in somewhat of not a public setting, but a place where there are other people around. And he suggested we go for a walk instead. And I was very intoxicated at this point. So I agreed to go for a walk with him. He was completely sober. I feel like that should be noted. So we go on this walk down Old Main Hill, and we stop on the south end of the hill. There's a little amphitheater over there. And we sit down and we kind of start talking, and then it's kind of a blur. 1 minute we're talking and the next he's on top of me. And it was really scary.
A lot of people think prevention means self-defense classes or telling people to avoid dark alleys or things like that. But when we do that, we're still putting the responsibility on the victims. And really, what we need to focus on is on the perpetration and the perpetrators. Why is this happening? Over 80% of people that perpetrate rape don't even self-identify as a rapist. And you can ask them, have you ever done this? Have you ever done that? Have you ever forced someone to do this, or coerce someone in this way, or blackmail someone? And they'll answer yes throughout, but if you were to ask them, are you a rapist? They would say no. That's another issue that we run into when we're talking about prevention, is that people have a very narrow-minded perspective of what prevention is. Prevention is, could we have pulled a gun out of his hand? But that's not really the issue. It's a much broader issue. We need to see how our systems are responding. And so we need to think in different ways than we have in the past. It's not about responding to an immediate situation. I think when we talk about, respecting women, about being, emotional, being, being able to express yourself in a healthy way, and raising, your children in a kind and loving way, everyone agrees with that. If you ask, you'll probably hear this over and over again, that victims are feeling more empowered to speak up. And I think that's helping to kind of hold a mirror up against society. Why is this happening? without fail, when you go into a room and you give stats of how prevalent sexual violence is, people are surprised, except females a lot of times. So I think it's important that, there's that accountability, that reckoning that's happening to some extent, but also it's helping us think about why is this happening and how can we stop it. If you were standing next to a river and people kept floating by that were drowning, yes, you're going to throw life jackets and ropes at them and try to get them out. But it's important also for someone to maybe go up the river and figure out why are people falling into the river and how can we prevent that from happening.
I had someone that I had befriended, someone that I felt like I trusted. And so when I was in a scenario where I was alone, I felt like I was safe because I knew this person and I knew they weren't going to hurt me. Unfortunately, this individual took advantage of that trust, but then made me feel as if I was a willing participant and therefore I shared part of the blame of what had happened. And growing up in a LDS home, I did carry a burden of shame and guilt because I felt like I had done something that I shouldn't have done, especially with someone who I didn't feel romantically interested in. So it was tough, and that carrying that, I think, was difficult for years and years and years until I grew up and I realized, that wasn't the case. But after it happened, the reason the pain was compounded in my experience was because then, as you know, high school can be a rough place, and he spun the story to make sure that certain things were said, and certain things were said happened that actually had not occurred at all. And so, of course, high school being a rough place, my reputation did take a turn for the worse for a year or so, and that was hard because it was this combination of guilt and shame for even having put myself in this situation, and then having to go to school and be reminded of what happened, and every day the story just got bigger and bigger. When I finally graduated high school, I still kept a really close group of friends. I never talked too much about what happened. Nobody really asked. But as I went into college and realized that what had happened was not something that I had wanted, and therefore I didn't need to carry the shame, that process began when I was I would say probably about 19. I was actually preparing to serve an LDS mission, and I realized that I needed to talk about it. And as I talked about it and realized there was no blame for me to be holding, I began that process. And it's continued from about 19 till about now. I'm almost 26, so it's been, as much time that it took for all the guilt and shame to build up, it's taken for it to be broken down as well. But I'm really grateful that I come from a home where I've never been shamed, I've never been silenced, and I'm grateful that I come from a generation that is willing to listen to survivors and to give empathy and understanding and just listen. And I think that's been an incredible part, because without that, I'm not sure if I would have ever completely healed.
What I think the Me Too movement did was, in a way, focus less on the adjudication and the response to these issues and more to the awareness of the magnitude of the problem. That more and more people would come out and say, me too.
And, I think initially everybody kind of freaks out and they're like, wow, what's going on? People are just getting raped and sexually assaulted more. And the reality is it's just been happening at these high numbers. It's just more people are coming in and seeking services. And I think Me Too has played a huge part in that. People are feeling empowered to step forward and to tell their story. We get calls on our crisis line that are like, I was impacted by this thing 20 years ago, and I didn't know how to talk about it until now.
I had, people that I didn't know at all, that I had never really talked to, that I didn't even know they knew who I was, reaching out to me and just saying thank you for your bravery and, let me know if you need anything. I'm here to support you.
There are some cases where an individual wants to take their abuser or their attacker and prosecute them. And that's empowering and that's important. But for some people, healing just comes from speaking.
I don't think people realize how hard the criminal justice system is as a victim. It's not an easy process to go through, to report, to be subject to, cross-examination, to go through all the pain and stress that being a victim in our court system has. And, I get that occasionally it may happen, but I think it's way overblown in terms of how it's talked about. Statistically, I can't even guess how few are false accusations. I think by far the vast majority are accurate, are real, and I think we need to treat them like that.
There were those two or three people who didn't have my back. They weren't there to support me, and they didn't believe me. But I have quadruple that number in people who are there to love me and support me. Immediately I was terrified to tell my parents, especially my dad. I don't know why. I was just so nervous, and he looked at me and he said, "I am so sorry. I believe you." I think it was a good way for me and my sister to bond, because she finally was like, "You know what? This happened to me too. I know how you're feeling. And I'm so sorry."
In some ways, it's made me a more confident person. This is probably the hardest thing I've ever had to go through. And so it's like, if I can do this, I can do anything. In a lot of ways, it's made me a stronger person, because I have been able to touch so many other people's lives. In helping other people, you start to help yourself. It's definitely made me more outspoken about the issue, because I feel like I've kind of gained this public profile for it. I feel, I guess, a responsibility to be very outspoken about it and to make sure that do my part at least to make sure that we're headed in the right direction.
For me to be able to share my story, and for people to look at me and say, "You're heard, let's do something to make sure that this doesn't happen again to anybody else," is just enough for me.
Lots of comments on why was she drinking? Why was she doing this? Why was she doing that? This doesn't really sound like rape, just kind of your classic victim blaming statements. And that was hard, especially because it was this is coming from random strangers hiding behind a computer. They don't know who I am, or the pain that I went through to get here, or the strength that I have to be here where I am today.
Fortunately for me, I was very empowered by the people around me. However, there have been many, many people that have come to me since, people that I know who have shared their stories, and I know for a fact that they were not treated well by their close circle. And I cannot tell you the damage that does.
I have a zillion billion people who love me and support me, but even when it's just one person, two people look at you and tell you that you are lying, they don't believe you, it hurts. Because you say, "You don't know, you weren't there."
Because when somebody comes out and shares their story and says, "This happened to me," the worst thing that you can do is look at them and say, "Are you sure? Is that really what happened?" That closes that door that they will never open up again. And the only way to heal from things like this is to talk about it and to get it out.
So I always like to tell people who want to get involved or who want to make a change, it's important to just start by believing and validating survivors. And I don't think a lot of people realize how much impact one can have just by doing those small things, like believing survivors.
I think an important thing to remember always is that we're around victims and perpetrators all the time. And a lot of perpetrators are normal people that we like. People who are in our classes or at work, who go to our churches, or are in our sports leagues. It's around us constantly. So if we don't realize that, then it's harder to take the next step.
And the easiest step is just to believe. If someone comes to you and tells you something, believe them, trust them. I think too often our initial gut reaction is to doubt, but we need to believe, and when it's appropriate, we need to speak out.
I think the most important thing you can do is believe them. You have to believe them. And maybe not ask so many questions. You need to let them talk. I think if you ask too many questions, then they feel like you may not believe them so much. They have to have control because it was taken away during the assault. You need to let them be in control of how they communicate, how they heal, and the choices that they make. If they choose to report it, if they choose not to report it.
I think just think before you speak, and just putting yourself in another person's shoes and being compassionate towards them.
It's hard to accept that someone that we might know could possibly be an abuser. But I think the part of it that we need to start talking about is it's easy to, when someone comes to you and says, oh, a stranger that I don't know hurt them. Oh, I'm so sorry, let me help you. It's when they come to you and say, hey, your friend did this to me.
Those words, I believe you, are so powerful. And mean it and be there for them. Be a support system for them. Don't carry it on your shoulders because that's not healthy for anybody. But let them know that you love them and that they will overcome this and that there is hope at the end of the tunnel.
Ask them how you can support them and tell them you believe them and you want to be there for them. And I think that really that's all most survivors want, is to be believed, because so often we're not believed. And I think that really is all that people want.